Happy October, everyone. A new month means a new Revolution balance patch, as well as a new Grand Prix on the horizon. There are so many cards we have to talk about today that we'll have to save a recap of Grand Prix Astrath for another time, but we'll still talk about some of the big decks that showed up at the tournament as they become relevant to this discussion. As always, if you want to give the format a try, you can find a link to the Custom Magic Discord in the description below, as well as the link to the Revolution card search engine Manifesto in case you want to look over any cards we discussed today. Let's hop in. Our major changes can be divided into two categories: overperformers in the first month of the Nylon season that have been toned back, and Nylon commons that have been adjusted for the set's limited environment, with a few stragglers here that don't quite fit into either category. In total, we have a whopping 38 cards to talk about: 15 commons for the aforementioned Nylon limited rework, and 23 other cards for constructed play. We'll breeze through the Nylon commons at the end, so for now, let's talk about the big reworks and work our way down. Perhaps the biggest single change this month is a death knell to the raw potency that was offered by Work Safety Violation. No longer will it shred tokens and rip up lower mana value permanents with brutal efficiency. Our new version feels very reminiscent of the canon card Make an Example, one that's never quite been constructed legal. But the upside here for paying extra mana on a more color restrictive cost is being able to tear apart all non-land permanent types instead of only creatures. I don't think Work Safety is completely out for the count here. 5 mana mass removal spells are still perfectly fine, especially when they're one sided, and you'll still always be hitting the things you want to clear most, or at least one of them, but it won't be anywhere near as ubiquitous as it once was. A lot of the archetypes that had some solid performance at the GP got their wrenches put to them this month, and nothing felt more fully in the crosshairs than Golden Age. The titular card behind the phenomenally performing control plan that made it to the top cut of the GP and saw 7 appearances in the League Decklists channel just from Caillou 102 playing it alone, as well as inspiring a completely separate aggro combo ball lightning strategy alongside Extraction Mission, has resulted in Golden Age and its backside both receiving significant adjustments to knock their power level down a bit. For starters, the policy side now requires 3 instances of its condition being met rather than 2, making it a little more difficult to flip it. Once you do flip, Harmony is far more stringent on what value it can yield for you. It no longer offers you a source of mill, leaving you a little more dependent on what you already have in your graveyard, and it now targets the card you're making a copy of rather than selecting freely, which makes it more vulnerable to instant speed graveyard hate. While I think there's still a world where this card can see some degree of play, a lot of the steam behind this card has been significantly clipped, which should hurt it moving forward. The title card itself wasn't the only piece Golden Age Control has seen get tweaked, though. Besides Work Safety Violation, that is. Get Your Wish no longer counts the colors of tokens you control, removing its problematic interaction with the pledge mechanic, which allowed it to fuel 3 mana sorceries and other non creature spells, particularly the unchanged Coup d'etat and the now changed Work Safety Violation, on turn 3, off of the back of a 2 mana pledger. This change is likely to relegate Wish from a control toolbox piece to a combo card, but with the biggest non creature combo plan revolving around incumbency, a strategy which actively generates cliques to meet its color requirement, I can't say I'm super optimistic about Get Your Wish here. Finally, and perhaps least notably for Golden Control, is the adjustment to Manifest the Light Veins. This one's smaller, the land just no longer gets Ward 1, but that is still pretty impactful in terms of how well players can punch through it. The aura is still largely as playable as it was previously, or not playable depending on who you ask, but the loss of Ward is a solid hit when you consider that aggro decks are likely to try and fill the void that Work Safety Violation was creating. And with that gone, cheap efficient removal is going to see a rise, which may result in Manifest being worse than ever. I mentioned this other strategy previously, but Control wasn't the only plan taking advantage of Golden Age. Extraction Mission showed up quite a bit across the GP, sometimes being used to get back Rough Riders for high impact plays and grindy value matches and solid mid range play. But it was also being used in conjunction with self sacrificing aggressive creatures like Vukorok Defector and Expendable Arsonist to transform Mission into a rapid fire burn spell. Now, with the returning creature entering tapped, this strategy could still exist, but would become reliant on that blue mana rider to get the creature into play on the opponent's end step, so that way the creature can swing immediately, which renders the extraction mission burn lines a turn slower. I don't think Mission's a dead card now. The Rough Riders are still very valuable, but even there, having the creature enter tapped will still hurt its ability to fight up against other creature decks. Golden Age wasn't the only popular card to show up at the GP, however. White Blue Tempo had a serious showing and had two of its pieces clipped out from under it to compensate. Social Engineering is likely the bigger hit of the two. The sorcery speed change is a significant hit, as the card was a phenomenal way to both temporarily remove blockers and protect against removal. And the flexibility to hold open mana for it played very nicely with the instant speed interaction and threats the deck had access to. At sorcery speed, I think tempo is probably off this one. It may still have some homes in decks like Portal Knights, but even there, the sorcery type line still hurts. Gentle Grasp has also received an adjustment, making this the third time the white piece of stack interaction has drawn attention and garnered a rework as a result. At the end of the day, giving white a means to both disrupt the opponent on the stack and draw a card at some point for your trouble has proven to be a little too effective. It's now back to no longer costing generic mana and exclusively costing colorless white hybrid. And rather than ever having anyone draw a card, the opponent can merely cast the exiled spell on any future turn by discarding a card on top of paying costs. I think Grasp still has its uses. Something like the Advisor's aggro deck will still be perfectly fine running it, but it's definitely not as splashable or potent as it has been. Another thing that got really cracked down on in this patch was mana generation from efficient pledgers, particularly Gubernatorial Fundraiser and Grassroots Campaigners. Fundraiser saw play across the Golden Age control decks for its ability to accelerate into an early Cathette, smooth the deck's mana, set up Hazak Arsenal, get some extra value with a Cringel Accords in play. Oh, and get your wish to be casting a 3-drop spell at instant speed on turn 3. Now, Fundraiser only makes the treasure when it dies, and still makes that token tapped. This does improve how well Fundraiser performs as a troublesome blocker, I guess, but that's a small gain considering its best use has been largely erased. It can still do a few things thanks to some of the sacrifice themes in the format, and may still have some solid play alongside Extraction Ritual, but it'll probably be a shadow of its former self moving forward. I'm hesitant to call the change to Grassroots Campaigners, however, a full-on nerf. Certainly, its potency alongside fetch lands like Redeveloped Cityscape has suffered a bit of a blow, as it can no longer come down on turn 2 to set up a double pledge on turn 3. However, now that it pledges on enter, this does help make up for the cost increase somewhat, and the stat buff it's received does look pretty notable in a format that may very well get swarmed by aggressive decks like tokens and red-white enchantments. I haven't seen much of the Skitter Tiller Gen's Slope Skitter plan so far this season, and maybe, in a strange way, the Campaigners adjustment has been exactly what this deck needed to help the cards fit into the curve perfectly. Ballot Registrar also took a hit alongside its fellow Pledge Uncommons, but rather than for its treasure generation, Registrar is paying penance for its synergy with Astrath, Center of Civilization, generating a different kind of mana advantage. I can't imagine the plan with these designs originally was to encourage a mono blue control deck that leans on Astrath as effectively a colorless soul land, but Platy people certainly found that synergy and ran with it. The deck was chock full of little grindy synergies, and all of them were pretty interesting, but Astrath costing 1 mana to activate and yielding 3 mana in a monocolor deck was just not where the curators wanted these cards to be. The change doesn't hurt too many other interactions, and if anything, this may help reduce the temptation for brewers to put subpar lands with mediocre activated abilities just to synergize with Registrar, but I don't think that not falling into traps is that much of a gain here, especially when Astrath can now always cost 2 to activate and will never cost 1. The rampant treasure generation at the GP wasn't just in the hands of Golden Age players, however. Anarchist piloted a Jund Investments deck all the way to the trophy at Grand Prix Astrath, and won the whole tournament off the back of Dante's Inferno being able to be activated at instant speed from the graveyard in the face of certain death. As awesome as that tournament winning play was, it can no longer be repeated moving forward, as Inferno has caught a timing restriction on its activated ability. I think the card's still solid, especially with investments, but that definitely does knock the deck down a few percentage points, as does losing the aforementioned work safety violation. Also a hit to investments is the adjustment given to Elephant of the Golden Palace. Blue mana can no longer allow this 7/7 elephant to enter with a hexproof counter, but rather only award 2 counter. This by no means erases elephant from the conversation. The indestructible counter being offered in white mana is definitely still valuable if you aren't worried about your life total, but it's still a little more fragile if you want to protect it from targeted removal. Even then, the Ward 2 does still punish your opponent for trying to fight it, so I think the elephant will still rock the battlefield in most cases for decks looking to stockpile treasures. Black Colorless Integrate has also seen some success this GP. It's had 2 cards adjusted, as well as 2 more cards cleaned up a bit, as they were modal spells with some funky, unfavorable interactions that resulted in a lot of judge calls. Protoclast Behemoth has gained 3 mana in its casting cost, drastically slowing down the rate at which your opponent will have to be worrying about the alien dinosaur. But it also picks up a nasty ward cost that will help ensure opponents have a harder time clearing it from the board. The only thing that stands out to me as a potential upside to the cost increase is that Behemoth now single-handedly puts enough counters on a Tide's Ire to generate an 8/8 Kraken, which becomes more appealing when Chittering Gargantua also does so. That all being said, I think Behemoth is more likely to just remain a tool for integrate decks, and a reasonably reliable one at that. Less reliable is Tithe to the Machine, which is no longer one-sided and instead hits each player at their upkeep. Further, rather than killing your opponents gradually as you integrate cards of their relevant types to it, the only way for Tithe to finish your opponent off is to have it pop, at which point you get a spontaneous board state. This, too, feels reminiscent of a canon card, Doom Foretold, and that card had some serious merit as a deck building payoff in its day. Tithe shares the challenge of being unable to feed your own tokens to it, which introduces a real deck building cost to the card, but I think Tithe could still do some fun things in the right list. As far as cleaning up the grindy black spells goes, Chronicle Extinction has had a template update to rearrange the order of its modes for a cleaner understanding of what it does when it's flashed back. At first glance, this kind of looks like a nerf. Players can now sacrifice small creatures that would die to the sweeper mode, which does make it worse, right? Well, due to state-based actions, this was always the case, and furthermore, creatures killed by the -3/-3 mode shouldn't be exiled by the hand attack mode to begin with. So all this update does is really clarify how all of the card's abilities are supposed to work, and save players some time spent on judge calls. Also helping out with the judge's time is the update to Iris Pledge, turning the sacrifice and discard modes into exile effects, allowing any player's graveyard to get exiled, and exiling a card from the top of the opponent's library to ensure that having no creatures in play doesn't just result in the spell being a blank box of text. Previously, Iris Pledge targeting an opponent with no creatures would result in you being unable to pay mana for any of its other modes, as the when a creature is sacrificed this way would never happen. To mitigate these generally positive changes, as now the card will always be able to allow you to pay those modes, the colorless mode has shed a bit of potency, making you discard a card if you want to copy an exiled card. However, if Pledge is the last card in your hand, that rider can be freely mitigated. But for a grindy card like Iris Pledge, that may not be so commonplace. Alright folks, it's happened. After 21 months of being in Revolution unchanged, Feast of Whispered Knives has picked up the legendary super type, limiting you to a single copy on the battlefield. I think there's going to be a significant knock to the potency Feast has going for it, as well as a hindrance to any deck looking to take advantage of Indulgence cards whatsoever, as this card is best when you have multiple copies in play. But I also don't think Feast is completely dead. Running multiple copies to improve the odds of finding one is still very worthwhile, and if nothing else, a slower Feast plan can now take advantage of the tech utilized in Platy People's Astrath deck by drawing a card off of Divine Mishap with Feast in play. All in all, though, I think Feast is likely to take a step back from the limelight, moving into Varro's Twilight months. Finally, in our list of full-on nerfs, we have a few cards that have been reworked entirely, and have had their primary archetypes largely erased as a result. The biggest victim in this massacre is Wake Up Call, which has been entirely replaced with Verdant Grandeur. Grandeur comes down far later and can't enchant artifacts, but does offer a bit more value on enter, let's be honest here. Grandeur will never replace what we've lost here. This is a serious blow to Pulsing Sound Seat and the cheap, high-tempo burst that 8-Call used to have. Considering the Curator's stance on one-mana dorks, this change isn't surprising, but it is sad nonetheless. Finally, for our list of nerfs, we arrive at Writhling and Company. It's a sad day for my greedy graveyard dreams, as the cards that yield value when they leave your graveyard are no more. Writhling has been completely reworked to instead drain opponents once a turn when cards leave your graveyard while this is in play, as well as having an activated ability from the graveyard at a decently sizable cost to draw a card and maybe pick something off in your opponent's bin. There may be a world where Writhling can still have a bit of play, but this will never amount to what it once was. And if Writhling got neutered, Zigzag's Apex has been executed. It no longer cares about leaving your graveyard whatsoever, instead only draining your opponents when you discard it for 3 mana, and being able to return it from your graveyard to your battlefield if you can build up 8 mana for it. A 3-mana burn spell that can't be so easily countered isn't atrocious, but it's hardly what you want in any deck that used to like Apex. The new version we have is vaguely interesting for Moonlight and Eternal, but considering Moonlight could have put the former version to use even better, I think there's just no salvaging Apex. The least impactful of the old Dune graveyard changes, still a bit hard to watch go. Vita's Offshoot no longer interacts with your opponent's graveyards when it leaves yours, but it does gain a point of power and Death Touch to make up for the loss. While the direct hand attack isn't awful, and Death Touch can be handy in some situations, I really don't see why you'd run Offshoot over Inner Ring's Pupil in most black decks that want this kind of effect, as shredding your opponent's hand repeatedly is just better than taking a single card, I think. Considering Offshoot's hand attack mode was seldom the reason to play it before this patch, I don't think this stat boost and additional keyword will save it. Despite all the things we're watching take a hit this month, we are receiving 2 interesting buffs for Constructed, alongside the common changes. Perhaps the most exciting is the cost reduction to Silman Regrafter, at the point of a cost of power. The counters deck felt like it wasn't quite there last patch, but just needed a small push to be more viable. While the work safety violation rework may be the bigger boon for these decks, as they are safer to invest their mana in low-cost scaling threats, Regrafter helps the deck ensure that it will have more consistent early game plays, while keeping opposing removal from being too impactful against you. Alongside Overbearing Researcher making that removal more costly, and Pinnacle of Progress feeling hard to clear on its own, maybe this is the time for green-white counters to rise and start taking names. Speaking of cards that can put counters on themselves, Builder of Monuments has also received a rework. Its type line has been changed to better line up with the established creature types of the game and on the art on the card, and it no longer spends the counters it builds up to search for artifacts and enchantments, simply limiting you to mana values equal to or less than the counters it has. It does receive a small knock to its momentum, no longer generating a build counter on enter, but I still think this change is pretty phenomenal. Builder has always felt like the kind of card that was almost there. Tapping without counters was always capable of finding a Warpway Rings to ramp up your mana, but now you can start to snowball value and start getting more powerful cards as the game goes on. It was also always possible to attack and search for Voyage of the Siren Sea with Builder before blocks, but with Builder never shedding its counters, I think there's more reason to invest into it on the board, which is very exciting for any artifact or enchantment decks looking to get some value in. Just please be responsible and don't use this to tutor Omen of Deception into play too much, please. Alrighty, with all of that out of the way, let's blaze through the Nyland common changes and call it a day. We'll go in alphabetical order for these, starting with the one that the curators felt deserved mention outside of the main bulk of common changes. Anesthesiologist has shed 2 points of toughness to drop down on 1 mana, now only costing 2, but conditionally only teaches itself lifelink when you control a white permanent or you just want to gain 2 life instead. I'm not so sure what the curators are cooking with here, honestly. I don't think this card has enough momentum to really match up to the state of the format, and having to attack twice to go beyond 1 toughness while requiring a white permanent in play for both attacks makes it a sketchy card to play out when token decks and aggro decks are looking to benefit the most from today's patch. Now granted, this theoretically scales up to deal damage at a close rate to Lurking Virkolakis, but Virkolakis gains more life and will realistically be swinging for an extra point of damage ahead of Anesthesiologist by also triggering when it enters. I just don't think this common can cut it. We don't have to spend too much time on Blue Collar Bloodsucker, but this is a nice boost to its strength and limited by always gaining life and being more likely to damage opponents without having to rely on treasure synergies as much. Neat. Bouncers for Hire is also largely skippable, but also a nice buff for limited. To save us all some time, just assume I'm a fan of these changes so I won't have to repeat myself, because I am a fan. Codename Cicada may actually be worth some consideration in Constructed, purely on the merit of now being eligible to activate for free if you control a blue permanent. Surveil 1 is a solid source of repeatable value on a 1-mana creature. It might not be super competitive, but this seems kind of sweet if you're looking to do some grindy self-mill value in Tyrell with Codename Spider. I know I said I wouldn't repeat myself, but Combat Corporal might be my favorite change of the bunch here. It's not super competitive by any means, but requiring a black permanent to make your blue creature capable of sacrificing creatures just feels picture perfect flavor. I also love the new flavor text. Great job here. Covert Infiltrator is also a buff that may merit some consideration, largely as the new colored permanent condition adds in a painless way to rebuy it when it's milled or surveilled. I'm not so sure where this could see play. My gut says this looks a lot better with Phoenix, but then returning it means it won't help fuel Phoenix's graveyard ability. We'll see if Infiltrator gets any testing. Demolition Team is now capable of slapping a lure effect onto the creature it teaches if they already had trample, which could be neat for some combat tricks, but doesn't seem particularly constructed viable. Perhaps the most exciting change in the common batch, Evasive Tactics has been reworked from a means of sneaking a creature through opposing blockers to a protection spell, shedding half of its mana cost and becoming an instant in the process. This may actually help white-blue tempo make up for the loss of social engineering somewhat, by still providing you a way to defend against removal, and might also be perfectly positioned for all the folks looking to lean more aggressive by teaching your creatures vigilance, letting you play offense and defense at the same times. I'm really excited to see how Tactics performs. Hazak Commandos is probably the one card in this bunch I'm very comfortable calling a nerf. Stasis has mentioned that the devoted lackeys into Commandos curve was problematic for limited, which is a great reason to tweak the card, but beyond its interaction with lackeys, it's also no longer an eligible target for extraction mission. Granted, I think it was like the 11th best mission target, but that's still something worth shedding a tear over. Smaller buff here, Inner City Scout's slightly more durable. I don't think it'll make it particularly viable for Constructed, but it's still neat to see. Main Street Hooligang no longer impulse draws when it dies, instead optionally fighting a creature when it enters. This feels like kind of a nerf for sacrifice decks, and it's a cool, funky removal spell in limited. Don't expect to see this in League unless your opponents decide to go really deep on a janky lizard deck. Penwrath Rope Runner got a bit of an overhaul, now buffing creatures instead of tapping or untapping them, and making those buffs permanent with an extra green permanent in play. It also costs an extra point of mana, so there's that. Rogue Justiciar has traded its counter ability for the Rope Runner, and has picked up the ability to tap creatures as a result. Probably nothing too special for Constructed here, even if folks start cooking with heroic strategies, though. Rush for Results is now easier to tap down a permanent with, but even when Studies in Cognitive Motion rotates in January, I don't think we'll see Rush get any play. Finally, Triumphant Herd has gained a point of power. I'm trying to think of a joke here, but it's kind of escaping me at the moment. No more Dreadmaw stat line. Cool. Anyways, that wraps up our discussion of the October Revolution card changes. I'm looking forward to hearing about what cards you all have your eyes on in the wake of this huge rebalance, and I can't wait to grind more League play and prepare for the next Grand Prix. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you in the Revolution chat.